Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Momentum. I'm your host today, Moya Mamora. And as you know, on this podcast, I'd like to share with you ideas on wealth creation, on spirituality, and how to live purposefully. Over the last few weeks, I've been on a series where I've been looking at different stories in the Bible and trying to figure out what sort of principles and ideas that we can draw from these that would help with informing perspectives around wealth creation, living purposefully, and also spirituality. So these are effectively spiritual principles that were being drawn out, but it's more so focused on business, your career, leadership, and generally speaking, wealth creation. Now, I always like to say this, and I'm going to do this again. Everything that we read in the scripture isn't necessarily prescriptive, but in the same way we can observe, like the Bible tells us in Proverbs that we can observe, just natural processes or just observe people, human interactions. And in all these different interactions, we can draw out what wisdom is just by observing these different people and how they behave, how they interact with one another, or just like how even animals, plants, whatever it is, like just the systems in our natural order and draw wisdom from that. So that's what we're trying to do here, is to read the stories, see what's happening in those stories, and from there, try to figure out if there are principles we can discern that would be useful and helpful as we think about how to create wealth, and as we think about prosperity, and as we think about living purposefully in life. So today, what I'd like to focus on is the story in 2 Kings chapter 4, and this is the story of Elisha and the widow woman. So you can read it. It's a very short story. It's a few verses. 2 Kings chapter 4 from verse 1. Effectively, what happens is there is a widow woman who goes out. Her husband had passed away. And the scripture says she cries out to Elisha and she says, hey, look, my husband, who was someone who was amongst the company of the prophets, effectively pretty much someone who was training to be a prophet. It says he passed away. There was so much debt. Now the creditors are going to come. They're going to take my children, and they are effectively going to force them into labor just so they can pay off the debt that the husband had left behind. And that's the story. And she says, help me. And what Elisha then does is he asks her, what do you have in your house? And her response was, nothing. I don't have anything. Well, except this jar of oil that I have. And then Elisha tells her, go borrow many jars, not a few, many of them, and go back into your house with your sons, shut the door, and then begin to pour the oil into the jars. And she did that. As she kept pouring, it realized that the oil kept flowing, right? As she filled up one jar, it kept flowing, filled up the next jar, it kept flowing. And then ultimately, there were no more jars, and she comes out, and Elisha says, great, just go sell the jars and then the jars of oil, and then go pay off your debt. Now, this story, if we try to think about it in the world today, is all too familiar, right? You're in a situation where there's a crisis in your life. Maybe there is a financial crisis in your life. You might have assets, right? And you just have a liquidity problem, meaning that there is something that requires cash right now that maybe you don't have, or there's a cash need and there's a deficit and you feel like I really don't have anything right now. I actually don't know how I'm going to take care of this situation and how I'm going to fulfill this obligation. I've been there. You probably have been there. There's a bill that's due. There's something that's pending, and you just don't know how you're going to manage that situation. And oftentimes, we look at ourselves and we say, I don't have anything. But what I like about this story is that the miracle, right, which it was a miracle, but in this particular context, the simplicity of the miracle is that you do have something. You do have a talent, you have a skill. Usually, what God needs to transform your situation already resides with you. When Elisha asks her the question, what do you have? Her first response, her first instinct is nothing. And that's the first thing that I challenge you about right now, is to do a self-audit, do a self-assessment, and say to yourself, what do I have in my house that I've neglected, that I've thought doesn't really have any value? Because that's an asset. Oftentimes we want to think about assets as just this one tangible thing, but your skill sets, your abilities, your talents, these are also assets as well. You can use those to deliver value to other people, and those can be exchanged for money. You can take those and you can sell them. But there's something that you have. What are all these different talents and abilities and skills, things that people have commended you for, things that people have celebrated you for? They've talked about, oh my goodness, Moya, you're so good at that. I love the way you do this. I love the way you do that, right? Granted, not everyone who tells you they love what you do is going to be willing to pay for what you do. That's all right. But that's why there is a market outside. And part of your responsibility is to then go find the people who would be willing to pay for what it is that you offer and what value it is that you provide. At a very basic starting level, the first thing you have to always be thinking about yourself, as I'm talking about this, is what do people recognize as value in you that you have treated so casually? It's so unconscious right now that you don't even think about it as anything meaningful. And that's like the beauty of expertise, right? If you are an expert in doing something, you make it look so easy that when people recognize it, you're like, oh man, no big deal. Like, yeah, I can do that in my sleep. But think about that as your jar of oil. That is something, because oil represents value. The jar represents capacity. Right now, it's something that is valuable, but maybe it's not enough to satisfy that situation, but there is value. You being able to do a self-audit and recognize that is the very first step here. And it's the very first thing that you have to recognize, because in that is where you start cultivating the value. The second thing that I like in this story is that he tells her, go borrow many jars, don't borrow a few. Now, what you see and what you have after you've done that self-audit, it may be something that's very small right now, but your next thought then has to be, how do I scale this such that it can satisfy the financial obligation or handle the financial gap that I have right now? I had a good friend of mine who I was talking to him about some challenges and how I needed money to do certain things. I mean, to be clear, I wasn't begging, but really just talking about the projects that I was working on and just like a similar liquidity crisis. I needed so much money. And, and he was like, well, anytime he needs money, he just thinks about what business he's going to start. Like what is he going to sell so that he can cover, the expense. And I think we were talking about a vacation then and, me going on a vacation with the family and so on and so forth. It's like, yeah, just like if your vacation is going to cost you, 20, 30, whatever that number is, $1,000, it's like, just go figure out a way to make the $30,000. And he said it so casually, like it wasn't a big deal. And honestly, from that moment on, it did something to me, because now my perspective shifts. It's like, okay, well, if I need X amount of money, how do I make it, right? If I need $30,000 by the end of the year, how do I make it? Well, that means I need to sell, something that's worth $1,000 to 30 people. Then I have to go out and I have to figure out that situation. Or I have to figure out a way to sell something that's worth $500 to 60 people, right? But the math is there. And if you have that mindset, the next thing you now start doing is, which is what the instruction that was given by Elisha to this woman is, go find the jars, borrow many jars. That's about scaling. That's about multiplying. And the many jars represent a few different things. What do I need to scale? I need customers. I need a network. I need operations. I need contracts. Whatever the infrastructure it is that you need to actually scale, you have to go out and look for it. You have to start thinking about it. Like, okay, if I have this skill, this talent, this ability that I've overlooked, and somebody recognizes the value, that's point number one. Doesn't necessarily mean that person that recognizes the value is willing to pay for it. But then I have to prove it out and then go find out, is there someone who would be willing to pay for this one thing that I'm capable of? This value that I have that I can deliver, right? Is there someone that's out there? And you have to then go out and say, okay, once I find that one person, how much are they willing to pay for it? Maybe I go out and I test it out. Would they pay $1,000? If I need $30,000 and that's the gap that I'm trying to close, would they pay $1,000? Maybe not. Will they pay $500? Maybe not. But the point is, if I can find someone to pay, then I can find out how I can scale. I can find out what's the archetype of this person. They're not my friend. They're not a family member, but they are someone on the outside that I've identified who recognizes value in what it is that I deliver. Then I need to go find a whole lot more of those people. And that's the aspect of scaling such that I can actually close that financial gap that I potentially have, or solve that liquidity crisis that I have right now. And I think that story is so powerful. So she goes out and she starts like reaching out to all her neighbors, all the people in the community that are around her to get those jars. And that's exactly how we are going to find that next customer, that next buyer, that next interaction that's going to help with closing that gap. Is she had to go out. She had to figure out a reason, because I can imagine in that context, people would have needed their empty jars as well. So I'm a Nigerian. One of the things that happens is there's a lady who cooks here, right? And she'd cook and she'd give you her cooler, right? Because that's where she puts all the food, right? So maybe she makes like jollof rice and she puts it in the cooler, and then she, it's delivered. She's hounding you, is like, look, where are my coolers? Like, I delivered this for you 2 days ago. You have to return my cooler. And I can imagine, and I say that somewhat facetiously, but I think the reality is everybody else in the community would have had use of their jars, of their empty jars. I don't think it was a world like today where you could go buy like a Tupperware in the store and just buy it in a dozen or half dozen and just keep it, right? It was a very different context, a very different situation. So she would have had to do something, say something to convince the people, to get them comfortable enough to give her those empty jars. And the prophet Elisha says, go borrow jars, not a few, a lot of them. And many of us quit because of the first challenge. It's like we go out and you interact with the first person and it's a no. But there's a resiliency that's required for you to go out and to not give up, right? I was listening to someone speaking one day, and who was talking about sales and the law of averages. That sales is a numbers game. That if I know that for every 10 people I speak to, I'm going to get 9 rejections, and I'm trying to sell 10 things, that means I have to speak to 100 people so I can get my 10 sales. So, but the secret then is, how do I not lose my enthusiasm after I've spoken to the 6th person? It's not a law of linear averages, but it's a law of broad averages. The idea being that if we say 1 in 10 people, it doesn't necessarily mean that if I get 9 rejections, the 10th one is going to be like, yep, an acceptance. It could be that I get 20 rejections and then the next 2 are wins, right? But if I look at the data in aggregate, on average, it would come out to that 1 in 10. And I'm not necessarily saying that, sales is a 1 in 10 effort, right? But it could be 1 in 10, it could be 1 in 5, but that's part of what you are going to have to figure out, and keep the same enthusiasm to go out and to try to scale this thing, or to try and ensure that whatever it is that you have right now, you have the ability to deliver that value to multiple people such that it closes that liquidity gap that you are potentially facing. And then she does that. And here's the other thing that we see, right? She gets the jars, and then the prophet tells her, take your sons and then go into the house, shut the door, right? And he says, start filling up the jars. Now, in this world of social media, everybody wants to put out their success. You're aspiring to something, and then just like the first glimpse of you making progress, you want to put that out there. But I read this as just like effort that's happening in secret, right? Work that is being put in behind the scene. You go in, you're not in the view of everyone that's out there, but you're putting in the work. You're pouring in the oil from one jar into the other jar. It's this concept of, how do I keep refining what it is that I'm delivering such that I can continue to deliver value to this person and to the next person. And I'm getting better in secret, right? It's like, how does Moyo continue to create these videos if people aren't necessarily sharing it? They're not engaging with it. They're not interacting with it. How does it happen? And you keep doing it because I'm working behind the scenes, and maybe no one knows me right now. Maybe people aren't sharing this in the hundreds of thousands. I'm not getting 1 million views right now. I don't have 100,000 subscribers. How do I keep doing it and not lose my enthusiasm? I was listening to Myron Golden, very, famous coach, teacher. One of the things that I admire about Mr. Golden is that Myron Golden drops a long form video every single day, sometimes multiple videos every day. And in my mind, I'm like, man, like, How does he do that? Like, how does he, first of all, how does he even have enough stuff to think about, to talk about on a consistent basis every single day? And he just does it consistently every single day, every single day. And that for me is very inspiring, right? And the other thing, I think the other parallel here is if you look at your like Instagram dashboard where it tells you the number of views that are out there. Well, even if, say, for example, you post a reel and that reel only gets like 100 views, right? Well, it only got 100 views. And there are other people that are out there that post one reel and maybe gets like 10,000 views. I think one of the things that I'm telling myself is, and I'm trying to adjust my mindset to this, is that, well, look, yeah, I want to do all the things that are necessary to get like a 10,000 views in videos or whatever, but don't despise the early days of you putting in the work, putting in the effort behind closed doors, where no one's seeing you, no one's recognizing what it is that you're doing. But don't despise those periods, right? Because if I'm trying to get the equivalent of 10,000 views on a video and maybe my reels are only getting 100 views, well, maybe that means that I just have to make 100 reels, right? and it sounds crazy, but it's just a mindset shift. It's like, well, I can compete with the person who posts one reel and gets 10,000 views if I make 100 reels every day that only get 100 views. That means that my dashboard would show me that my average is 10,000 views as well, because it's showing, granted, it's probably showing it to the same people, but there's also a percentage of that that's being shown to an audience that aren't necessarily my followers. It seems like a very simple, minor example, but the idea here is that there's work, there's effort that happens behind closed doors where there isn't much visibility. You're not really seen right now, but there is the pouring of the oil, right? Because you are working to expand capacity, you're working to deliver value, taken from that seemingly small one jar, and then you're just working to deliver value to people, at a level that is scaled, that's multiplied. And it may seem that while you're putting in the effort behind closed doors, no one's singing your praises, no one's recognizing you yet, no one's quote unquote feeling your influence. It doesn't really matter, but there's a consistency and there's an effort that's happening when no one's seeing it, right? And then you pour all of that in there. So you're refining your sales, you're refining your skills, you're refining your abilities, you've gotten enough feedback from the market, you have the infrastructure to scale. And then the next thing he tells her is once everything was done, he tells her to sell it. But not what's interesting here. The miracle only stopped when the capacity stopped. So oftentimes, God wants to do so many things in our lives. God wants to advance us and wants to progress us in certain ways, but he's limited by the capacity that we have. Think about this. You might be in business and you may think like, oh my goodness, I've been working on this business for a long time, or you're at this job, you're at this company and you're like, man, I've been capped at this level for a long time. It feels like I'm limited in this area. Well, first of all, you do have something. But the second thing you got to be thinking about is like, is my capacity hindering my progress here? Because I can pray for promotion. I can pray for success in my business. But if I haven't audited what I have that could be valuable that I can be putting out there and actually working to refine that and expand my capacity, maybe I'm actually the limiting factor. Maybe that's what God is waiting on me to do before he can actually thrust me into the limelight or progress me. Or maybe he's pouring in the oil and the oil is only just like limited by how many jars in quotes that I have, right? So therefore, if I want to experience more blessing, more increase, more prosperity, create more wealth, then maybe there's a part of it that requires me expanding my capacity, learning new skills, refining my current skills and capabilities, getting better education. If I'm running a business, I've heard, folks like Homorzy say things like, you don't have a business problem, you have a customer problem, right? It's like, you have to go find customers. Yes, the fact that you have a business where you have a certain number of people who are buying something from you, it means you do have a business. Now, what you got to do is go out there and go find customers, because maybe that's what your limitation is. And you haven't learned to sell and you haven't learned to skill in that particular situation. So the oil stopped when the jars stopped. When there were no more jars for her to pour into, that's when the oil stopped flowing. And I wonder if for us, if that's the limiting factor, is my capacity limited? Am I set up? Am I organized in a way, as my infrastructure set up such that it's actually limiting my capacity for growth and for expansion? And that's actually something that is meaningful, to think about, right? Because if you really thought about it, you'd probably say to yourself that, you know what, yeah, I think the way I'm set up is actually limiting my growth. If, for example, you had 100 new customers coming today, do you have the setup to be able to handle that? And I think for a lot of people, including myself, the answer is probably no. The answer is probably no. And it's almost like a chicken and an egg problem that we all have to deal with. Is like, well, do I get the customers first of all and then work on deploying the infrastructure, or do I invest in the infrastructure first of all and then go out and then market, or do I do both together, right? And I get it, when you're bootstrapping, it's very, very difficult. Trust me, this comes from a guy who's bootstrapped what I'm doing right now, my businesses, right? My entrepreneurial ventures, right? It is challenging, right? Because you are consistently making capital allocation decisions, right? But always optimize for staying power, always optimize for capacity development and growth, because these things would ultimately pay off at the end of the day. Well, that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you found this meaningful. Hopefully you found this helpful. Would encourage you to drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with someone. Like this video as well. And if you're not a subscriber, because I know there are a lot of people who are seeing this and you're not a subscriber, I'd encourage you to please subscribe to this so you can get more content like this. Well, connect with me on Instagram at Moyo Mamora. That's MoyoMamora. God bless you all and see you next time.